Open up the door, it's Dave!
Some years ago, I created a podcast series about my grandmother. Now, you're thinking probably, your grandmother? What the heck, Dave? What's going on there? And let me just tell you, she lived a rich and interesting life. She was growing up during the Depression and became somewhat of a con artist. And I tell the story through this podcast series about her life and the things that she did. And what I wanted to do was preserve it for posterity. I thought I'd bring it over to YouTube as well and put it out here as a video that kind of describes up who she was. Now, keep in mind that this is really based on a podcast series. There's not a lot of video to go along with it, but I hope you enjoy the story of my grandmother. Part 1. Her Ancestry. Some years ago, I met James Randi. He's the magician, the man who took on the faith healers and the paranormalists. I had a few encounters with him over the years that followed, as did my brother. My mom was so close to working with him at one point. He was outgoing and we thought we knew him at least a little. Turns out, his life was a big mystery, and a few years after his death, a documentary came out, and it was called An Honest Liar, which revealed who he really was. Sure, he was the things we remembered, but he was also many other things. And that got me to thinking about my grandmother. She was quite the character, and it wasn't until late in her life that I had really any idea who she was. She lived by her own rules and could rightfully be called an honest liar. This is my account of her, starting with her background. My great-grandmother's, that is my grandmother's mother, Helen, can trace her family tree back through the Netherlands. They were Jewish immigrants who found a home there and lived for several generations. My research suggests that they once lived in Spain and were descendants of the same lineage of the more famous Del Montes, people of the mountains who started an agricultural co-op. But during the Inquisition of the 19th century, the Catholic Church sought to cleanse themselves of non-believers. Therefore, some members of the Del Monte family, along with many others, who identified as Jewish, were driven out of Spain. And ultimately, they settled in a few places, including the Netherlands. When you look at the historical records, you notice that the family members all had traditional Jewish names, which would suggest that they held on to their faith. And then in the mid-1700s, a few family members emigrated to England. They settled there and became truly British. They married and lived there for a couple of generations. Helen, the aforementioned great-grandmother, was born there. She died when I was in high school, so I have a fairly good memory of her. She always had the British accent, which I found interesting. She told me once that her father, Moses, wanted to seek his fame and fortune in the United States and suggested the family move there. The ship manifest I found said that they made their voyage in 1907. Helen would have been around 14 at the time. But the part that Lala, that's the name that I called her, added onto this was that her mother, Caroline, didn't want to leave her life in England, and so she told Moses to go and take some of their 12 children with them. I believe he wound up taking 4 of them, including Lala. She told me that she never saw her mother again after that, ever. I think it saddened her, and she decided that if she ever had a daughter, they would be close. My great-grandfather, David, with whom I share a name, was born in New York. His parents both came from Austria and came to the U.S. in 1875. They were also Jewish and carried the name Silverstein. A side note here is that immigrants to Ellis Island would often list Austria as the country of origin because it was widely known that people would be accepted from there. Don't miss the fact that the immigration policies of that era were not much different than they are now. People with wealth easily got into this country. Poor immigrants were derided and made examples of and turned away or otherwise shunned. And immigrants from certain countries were just told they weren't welcome. Some people figured it out and were educated enough or savvy enough to pass themselves off as coming from a country that was more generally accepted. Looking at my family, the genealogy suggests that their actual origin was probably Hungary, though it's hard to know for sure. Now, I don't know much about David and Helen's life together. It would seem that David was a bit of an enigma. He did what he had to survive and provide for his family. Along the way, he used a number of pseudonyms for himself, and I don't think he ever did enough to really get noticed and recorded in history to a large degree. Lala did tell me that she was married at around 18, but it turns out that's not quite true. Her marriage record shows that she was married in March of 1913 when she was 20. They had my grandmother, Tessie Silverstein, in what may have been about August of 1913, which would mean she was probably pregnant when she got married. But such is the nature of life, though I imagine it was embarrassing in some way, and so the story got morphed along the way. And here's where the confluence of my grandmother's fanciful or perhaps fictitious stories and the publicly available records come into play. As you may know, records were often handwritten, sometimes incorrectly, kept in filing cabinets, and sometimes they went missing or were destroyed. I'll cover this topic in a future episode, but for now, just understand that her birthday may or may not have been her actual birthday. And as I'll tell you later, it was changed several times along the way. So it's hard to pinpoint the exact dates for life events, but it lends itself to making this more of an intriguing mystery. It was the early 1900s. There was a lot happening in New York at that time. The Silversteins found housing where they could. I see on the census reports that they lived in various tenement buildings over the years. David did odd jobs, but mostly worked as a painter. He got paid daily wages, and they lived a somewhat meager existence. He wrestled, sometimes professionally, and made a little extra money that way. Now, according to the records, Helen and David had another daughter, Ethel, born in 1915, but she apparently died within a few months of her birth, so Tessie remained an only child. What I find strange is that there's a birth record and a death certificate for Ethel, but I can't find anything on Tessie's birth. I do slightly wonder if there was some other misdirection that was perpetrated, though I really have no idea why. It just feels like there's more going on here. In any case, Tessie was being raised in the Bronx as a Jew. Things may have been difficult, especially financially, but as far as I can tell, they lived a pleasant life. Now, there is one notable thing about both my grandmother and my great-grandmother. They had fiery red hair, a trait that made them stand out in a crowd. I would say generally, it seems like everything was okay with the family. That is, until the Great Depression. Work was hard to come by, so my grandmother dropped out of high school at around 16 and wanted to help her parents earn money. She started working the streets of New York and coming up with schemes, plans, and grand ideas. She told me she was a hustler and did errands for people, filled out forms for those who couldn't read and write, stood in lines, learned the ropes about how to read people, and I would assume learned some skills that were related to grifting. Flash forward slightly, as the clouds of war gathered in Europe heading into World War II, my great-grandparents were acutely aware of the treatment of Jews and what was happening in countries from whence they came. David decided it was time to distance the family from their Jewish heritage. Tessie was told that they were never to mention being Jewish, and they changed their name to Fields. Or maybe it was Field, with no S. I could find no formal recording of a name change in the archives, but there were documents with the S and without the S, so I'm really not sure which one was their actual name, Field or Fields, or that it even mattered. My grandmother never talked about this, ever, other than to say she had left her past behind. Sometime around the time I was in high school, it started to click that she must have been Jewish and given it up for some reason. Safety, I would assume, but I really don't know. In 1934, my great-grandfather died. He would have been about 41 at the time. The official story is that he was painting a steeple and he fell off a scaffolding. One weird thing about his death, though, my grandmother told me he had a safe deposit box key in his pocket, which was given to my grandmother as part of his personal effects. But she was unaware of a safe deposit box that he might have had, and didn't have any clues about it. Another little mystery that remains unresolved. I guess he had his secrets too. Now, my grandmother said that was a seminal moment for her, that now her ability to make money became extremely important. She had to take care of her mother and herself. One thing that always troubled me about these events was the relative timing. My grandmother was learning the confidence game. My grandfather may have been doing the same, or perhaps more. He was a wrestler, he was a painter, he was other things. My grandmother told me she learned the work ethic from him, the hustle. I have so many questions. Was changing their name a decision to run from their own past? Was it so that he could make more money wrestling if he wasn't Jewish? Was he involved in other things? Was he possibly in some kind of trouble? Had he crossed someone in a bad way? Could it be possible that his death wasn't quite so accidental? Look, I have no way of knowing or even finding out. It's been way too long and everyone who might know anything is long gone. So I can happily assume that it was all coincidence and just leave it at that. But it still intrigues me. Part 2. Her life as a young adult. It's the late 1930s. My grandmother continued to do whatever she could to make money. Mostly she worked in restaurants, but clearly she was doing other things as well. Based solely on the stories she told me, I believe she was doing some more illicit things. She may have been running numbers for the mob and helping some gambling operation. She probably made money pulling cons at times, very small time things, I would think. And I wouldn't doubt that she was engaged with organized crime in some way, even tangentially. Based on a few of her comments over the years, it's also possible that she worked in what would colloquially be called a house of ill repute. Though I suspect it's more likely she worked as a hostess or somewhere in the background, rather than being engaged in the primary business. Then again, maybe she worked as, I'm hoping, a non-physical escort of sorts, in order to continue her confidence game. What a great way to meet a mark. After her father's death, she and her mother lived together for another year or so, and then her mother met and married her second husband, and the three of them living in the same flat would have been uncomfortable. And this is where the next phase of her life started. Her side of the story is that she met a man at a restaurant she worked in, and the two became friendly. He was an uneducated and illiterate man who had immigrated from Newfoundland. I think he was an easy mark in a way. She could build a relationship of sorts and have a place to live, and possibly could help her with whatever she had going on, even unwittingly. Do this favor for me. Can you pick something up around the corner? Those would have been easy asks, and he would have done them for sure. The story at this point is that my grandfather offered to open up his place and have her as a roommate. But it was 1935, and a single man and a single woman rooming together just wasn't done. It wasn't acceptable. The answer was obvious. They'd get married as a cover. And undoubtedly, being married would give her a different level of street credibility. She took on her third surname of her life, Kennedy, and lived her life and continued her business for a few years. One of the pieces to the puzzle that's missing for me is what their life was like. They were roommates, and as far as I know, really nothing more. Yet they were married, and my grandfather took that seriously. Prior to that, he always had a girlfriend on his arm, according to other family members. That's just how he rolled. So how did this work for either of them? My grandfather was a simple man, and probably wasn't in on the con games. He may not have even been aware that they were going on. Now, in early 1941, Tessie found out she was pregnant. This was going to put a wrench in everything she was doing. Or maybe she could leverage it and parlay it to some advantage. Only time would tell. She long held that Nick had conspired with a Chinese restaurant to drug her tea, and he took advantage of her. But I have to tell you that's a complete and total fabrication. He would never have been able to pull off something like that. Telling everyone this was another way she could get the scheme going in the long run. Pity her because her husband took advantage of her. My dad was born in September of that year, and shortly after, she noticed that he had some issues that were being exacerbated by the cold weather. Or at least, that's what she told everyone. So she made a decision to move to Florida, ostensibly for my dad's health. And since she had family on Miami Beach, it made sense. My grandfather had his business. He did odd jobs, sometimes as a painter, mostly as a mechanic. So he wasn't quite ready to move, and so she and my dad moved south to Miami. She could be free to tell anyone any story she chose to and start all kinds of new cons. It didn't take her too long to familiarize herself with the area. You had Miami like around downtown, and then you had Miami Beach. There were people who lived there year-round, but there were also wealthy people who came down for the winter to enjoy the sunshine. Now here's where I take a little bit of a fanciful approach to this when I talk about what her life was like. I don't know the details, I don't know the specifics, but I do know what I have heard from other family members along the way. As far as I can tell, she came up with schemes to sell them trinkets, hawk some products, or steer them to something like a tour or a reservation or a dinner show or something. Perhaps through people she knew, she got a little piece of the action. What I can tell you is there were plenty of opportunities, and pushing a stroller at times was definitely a help to her. The poor lady just wants to feed her son, for goodness sake. Now, again, as far as I can tell, she had her little cabal of friends who she interacted with. They were mostly street hustlers like her, but there were some people running legitimate businesses, and she could steer people to them. She did know some lawyers too, apparently, which would have helped her stay out of some trouble. I do wonder if she befriended any policemen or if she ever ran afoul or was picked up by the police for any activities that she had going on. Now, as far as I can tell, things were going well for her. And then, disaster for her. My grandfather decided he wanted to move south as well. Like I said, he took their marriage seriously. After all, they'd been together for around a decade at this point. And they had a son. The story I've heard, told many times over, is that this really irritated Tessie. She got what she wanted along the way. And she was living the life she wanted to lead. And now she had to change course. Things were going to be different. Part 3. The Art of the Con. Tessie developed skills that essentially are those of a confidence artist. As the name implies, it's someone who artfully or skillfully gains someone's confidence, or their trust, to gain some sort of an advantage. A con artist often has what's described as a grandiose sense of feeling and invulnerability. In all likelihood, this came about because she had this desire to help her parents as sort of a victim of circumstance. But it's also possible that she just realized that she could see through people and that would be an advantage to her. There's a book out there called The Confidence Game where Maria Konnikova goes into some detail about the art form. And what she says is, we're all most likely to be conned when we're emotionally vulnerable and lonely. It's when we're most desperate that we're most grateful for the kind stranger who shows up with the easy solution, and most likely to quash the inner voice whispering that things are too good to be true. I was surprised at how ordinary a lot of them seemed. It's not like you can see them and say, oh, this is a pathological liar. This is a psychopath. This is an evil human being. A lot of them seem just like the girl or boy next door, perfectly unremarkable. Seeming unremarkable is part of the game. Most con artists have a distinct psychological profile, including the so-called dark triad. Traits of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. But plenty of people that fit the dark triad don't become con artists. They become lawyers or marketeers instead. And plenty of people who aren't psychopaths also fall into the business because they badly need money. But nearly all con men are extremely perceptive and skilled at reading people. Those skills are transferable to other spheres, and sometimes it's hard not to admire their cleverness. We shouldn't forget that these are bad people who ruin lives. But of course, you have a grudging admiration for them because they're really, really good at what they do. The name con artist really does capture it. They're artists, and I have admiration for all artists. And I think that kind of encapsulates sort of everything that I would think about my grandmother. Now, we know that there are examples big and small out there. On the grand scale, you have people like the recently disgraced Congressman George Santos. Then there's Bernie Madoff, Ferdinand Waldo de Mara Jr., who pretended to be everyone from a surgeon to a prison warden, Frank Abagnale, who literally printed money and who was featured in Catch Me If You Can. And there's a psychic named Sylvia Mitchell who was convicted on 10 counts of grand larceny in 2013. So the examples are out there. And then there are the small-time street hustlers who entice people with the prospect of riches from three-card Monte or similar street hustles. This was my grandmother's place in it all. She found ways to work the streets during the Depression and used the fact that she was a woman to her advantage. Plus, she looked younger and had ID to prove it, even if it was a lie. And the red hair made her stand out in a crowd. People remembered her and she used that to her advantage. I don't know specifically what she told people, but undoubtedly, stories in her repertoire included items about her husband taking advantage of her, being abusive, or perhaps being some sort of war widow. Anything to play the game and make people take pity on her so she could make the things work to her advantage. It's all about gaining trust and getting people to believe in you. She excelled at that skill throughout her life. She could see people for who they really were, too. She sized up my friends, other parts of my family, and people she met. And she'd sometimes tell us about these people and what she saw in them. Getting to know her, especially as an adult, I saw some of her methods and some of her tells, too. When she was working someone, she'd be coy and sort of quiet and shrug a lot, unless something specific was needed from her. Then, when she understood the person, she'd start laying the foundations for whatever her ask was at that time. In the con game, there's the grifter, that's the person who tries to leverage you. There's the mark, the person who will be used, and then there's the play. That's where the game lies. It could be that there's a want of money or information, but the con artist will work to get that information from the mark. And that's where some of the information about documents that I mentioned before and changed documents and forged documents comes into play. In the 1920s and 30s, everything was based on paper and put into file cabinets. From birth records to marriage records to deeds, this is how it all worked. If you traveled from one place to another and needed records from the first place, they had to send a copy. Things sometimes were typed, but mostly they were handwritten. A clever person could easily erase a part or change a number or a letter to make it work to their advantage. A raised seal might be the only thing that made it look official, but a person could create a seal or talk someone into sealing a document for them. The document could get lost in transit intentionally or exchanged for another one, and more importantly, they could be relatively easily altered if someone was so inclined. I've read about people who made a living at doing this, albeit illegally, and if you were determined, well, you could find a way. I found a document in my grandmother's file that was a copy of a, quote, delayed birth certificate that had a section titled Abstract of Evidence in Support of Application. It's filled in with some information that details when her mother arrived by ship, census information, and public school info, but the info in it is incorrect. But you only know that if you know who she was and where she came from. Who changed it and when is anyone's guess, but that's one way she was always able to get younger. Now, one thing I can also tell you is this document does have a raised seal. I have to assume that wasn't the only time she modified documents to her advantage. Of course, documents that were lost or possibly destroyed by a natural disaster would have to be recreated over time, and that would take some effort, but may be helped along by a savvy con artist. Part 4. My paternal grandfather. I haven't talked much about my grandfather to this point. His name was Nicholas Kennedy. He was born in Newfoundland in 1904. He was the son of Irish immigrants who, like many other Irishmen, among them Kennedys, left Ireland for better opportunities in life. Now, I'd like to take a moment and give one quick note about the pronunciation of this place in Canada. Some say Newfoundland, and some say Newfoundland. Most Canadians will tell you it's the latter, Newfoundland. But as I've been told by people who come from there, they don't much care. So you may hear me pronounce it both ways. Apologies to anyone who feels strongly about it one way or another. I'm going with the perspective of people that I know that still live there, who go and say either way works. The genealogical records here are kind of interesting. The Kennedy clan all had sons and daughters named Peter, Nicholas, Mary, and other fairly common names. But the key to my research was that I knew that Nick had a brother named Dolph, short for Rudolph, and a sister named Mercedes. This made things a lot easier. I could kind of leaf through the records and find family names for them and match them to the ages of parents and work out from there. I was able to make a few generations back before the records just became too complicated. Still, it was helpful. Nick left home when he was about 18 to seek his own fame and fortune. He emigrated to New York in the early 1920s, and the records are sometimes hard to parse and things get somewhat vague. There were a lot of Nicholas Kennedys who came through the immigration channels like Ellis Island around that same time, but mostly they came directly from Ireland. There was a Nicholas Kennedy that arrived from Newfoundland in about 1921, and some of the information is absolutely correct. The dates match up, the locations match up, everything seems to work there, and it works fairly well. But there's one thing about it that strikes me. It lists his age as 10 years old, though it appears that he was traveling alone. Now, I'm going to assume that someone misrecorded his age, or perhaps an 8 appears as a 0 in the document due to penmanship, fading, or some other event along the way. It wasn't uncommon for these types of mistakes to happen, so it's fairly likely that he was 18 and it just looks like a 10. My grandfather was alive when I was in grade school, and he lived with us for a little while. I remember some stories about him being a little fluid about traveling back to see his family at times, perhaps as far as Newfoundland. Maybe he went to New York, I'm not sure. But I can't say the frequency or how that would work. After all, he never finished grade school and was functionally illiterate. He also was known to hoist a pint fairly regularly, and his memory suffered as a result of that, so it could be that this is all a little fictitious in his mind. He said he kept in touch with his sister, too, but I don't know if he ever saw her. I was able to determine that he left New York again at some point and returned in 1930. This time he stayed and wound up being naturalized in 1934. His listed job was as a mechanic, which aligns with the stories he told about fixing machines. And now to his side of the story about how he and my grandmother met. Now, he told us a story about meeting my grandmother at a horse racetrack. Why was she there? It really makes no sense unless she was running numbers or pulling some sort of a con. A racetrack might be the right place to meet gamblers and marks, but a single lady at a racetrack might be a little unusual. I can't say with certainty that they met there, and even if they did, it could have been a completely innocent encounter, but that's his story. Nick said that her red hair caught his attention, and he started chatting with her and remarked how it reminded him of a racehorse he just won money on, which is kind of a strange story, but I guess it works in a way. He was a simple man. He saw a woman that he liked, and meanwhile she sized him up as a sort of a mark. Look, she could arrange to live with him and use the marriage to her advantage. They got married in 1935 and stayed together for some years. Now, I have no idea what their early marriage was like, but I wouldn't doubt for even a moment that she had him doing errands, making introductions to other gentlemen he knew for whatever activity she had in mind, or had him otherwise helping out in her enterprising spirit in some way. It was pre-World War II, and we're in the Depression era. His work was not steady. He would be gone at all odd hours, and I think he managed to get back to Newfoundland at times. But make no mistake, while I think he really liked her, this was a marriage of convenience. Part 5. The 1950s. Tessie had moved to Miami sometime around 1942, taking my dad with her. Nick joined probably about a year later. Through the remainder of the 1940s, they lived somewhat separate lives. My grandfather mostly did day labor. My grandmother worked in the evenings and took care of my dad for part of the day. Tessie changed her name to Terry, with 2 R's, though I couldn't tell you why she changed it. She maintained the name Kennedy, but was really growing to resent her husband. She started seeing other men, and the story she told, according to someone who knew her, was that her husband had died, though I think a variation on it was that it was during the war, so she was the widow with a young son. Her birth year also comes back into play here. She was born around 1913, so in 1950 she would have been 37. To support her story of being this war widow, she typically would knock about 10 years off of her age and say she was under 30 with a 9-year-old son. So it all fit with this sort of sob story. She used that sort of thing to her advantage constantly. Her artistry was on full display when she told me stories about some pictures she had of my dad. What she would do is take my dad down to the department store and get him some clothes or a toy or something. She would use the sob story and take it on a trial basis or on a layaway plan. She would then go to the photo studio for a free sitting, then return all the things she had gotten and bargain with the person once the prints were made. Sometimes she got one free picture saying she wanted ones for her family and would be back, and sometimes she would just use the story to her advantage and just take that picture. I don't know what else she did, but she had a nice collection of pictures that she had made for free. It fits with her pattern of behavior, of course. She lived by her own set of rules. There was a story my dad told about how he and his mom went to Cuba in the early 1950s. Cuba at that time was well known for its hotels, its gambling, and its organized crime. Every manner of illicit activities was going on there before Castro took power. My dad said my grandmother won a contest to go there and visit. He was in awe of having left the country and doesn't remember much about anything specific. Look, it wasn't that unusual for Americans to travel there, and it was an easy trip from Miami. I know other people who would go there for dinner or to take in a show or to visit a brothel for that matter, so it wasn't a huge deal to get there if you had the means. A prize was an interesting entree, though. Was it really true? Or was there something else going on behind the scenes? Did she go there to meet someone? Or was she on an errand? Her son would make a great cover in any of those cases. Or maybe she just happened to meet someone there who opened a con woman up to new possibilities. I'll never know, but I have to keep in mind that she never won much otherwise. So it really, and didn't travel out of the country again until maybe the 1970s. So it's kind of a strange thing that way. In any case, the prospect intrigues me, even if there's nothing more to it. My grandmother's family, an aunt, some cousins, had also moved to Miami Beach. There was a Jewish enclave there, and they would see Terry every so often and had gotten to know my dad. From the stories I heard, they never met her husband. I have to assume she told them she was divorced or he had died or something, but I really have no idea what she told them about him. But he was never in the picture. Keeping their relative distance, Nick and Terry were pulling off a lie of sorts. Each of them had an act they were playing. My dad recalled spending some limited time with Nick as he was growing up. He would work days, maybe 6 days a week, then head to the pub for a drink. My dad would go with him and wait on the steps with the other boys until Nick had his fill. Then he would make sure my grandfather got home. Along the way, he also helped Nick to learn to read, which would probably change the dynamic in the house, I would guess. My dad said around the time he got to middle school, his parents started to fight whenever they were around each other. So they stayed away as much as they possibly could. My grandfather took a trip to Newfoundland at least once, and then they separated. My grandfather stayed in the apartment, and Terry moved out. Terry had a new address in Miami Beach. My dad couldn't tell you how she afforded it exactly, but she did. She went to work in the hotels on Miami Beach, which were just entering their heyday. The glitz and glamour was on full display. People would flock down from New York, giving rise to the term snowbird, during the winter to be at these amazing new hotels on the beach. I believe she worked at several over the years, but the ones she talked about the most were the Carillon and the Diplomat, which are hotels that are still on Miami Beach today, though they've changed a lot. She was a hostess, she delivered drinks, and she became what's known as the entertainment coordinator. This is the person who let everyone know about the activities at the hotel. My dad remembered going with her to set up things for different events, like he ran a movie projector on weekends that allowed guests to see a film in the hotel ballroom. So there was a lot going on, and my dad was involved in it, so he saw her in her element. These hotels were famous for inviting celebrities to take a vacation and stay at their place. Often it was with an offer of a free weekend if they'd do one show on a Saturday night in return. The guests at the hotel got a free show in an intimate setting and could even meet these celebrities in person. Terry was responsible for coordinating the timing, making sure the rooms were set up, and ensuring the seats were filled in the theater so these entertainment people, these giants, these legends, could play to a packed crowd. She met almost every big-time performer at the time, as they drifted in and out of the hotels in the area. And that brought some credibility that she was more than a social coordinator and actually knew these people. But we'll come back to that in a future episode. But there was another thing at play. It was well known that the mob, it's a different one than you typically think about in New York, were involved in these hotels. They ran various illicit businesses. The state of Florida was talking in the mid-50s about legalizing gambling, and this would have been a huge boon to these hotels. Of course, it never happened, but in a way, it probably did. At most of the hotels, there were back rooms where locals, guests, and anyone with a buck could place a wager on most things. But to keep it out of the public view and away from the local police, you couldn't just walk up to a window and wager. Instead, there were runners who took the money and the chit to these rooms in the back and then would deliver the winnings to the guests. In many cases, the valets, waitresses, bellboys, and other hotel staff were the ones handling the business. They were expected to have money because they were in a cash business. They made a little money from the house, and they also took tips from the people they were working for. Was Terry involved in this? We'll never know. But being the entertainment coordinator gave her a lot of access to everyone, and the additional income would make it easier to pay for her own place that we don't know how she afforded. Part 6 I refer to as the incident. One of the men my grandmother got familiar with was a guy named Jose Garcia. He told my dad in high school at the time he was Mexican, which never felt like it was quite right. There were a number of Cuban exiles in and around Miami and Miami Beach. My mom said he reminded her of Ricky Ricardo when she met him. Desi Arnaz, of course, was Cuban, but it's entirely possible he had his secrets too. But it really doesn't matter to the point of the story. Jose apparently worked in the hotel part-time and also owned an electronics repair business. Terry, who was now going by Teresa Kennedy, invested in it, or so everyone was led to believe. The question was, with what money did she invest? My dad went to work at the repair shop when he was in high school and learned more about how things work, electronics, and so on. This would have been the beginning of his career as an electrical engineer. The interesting side note is that in December of 1956, the Miami Herald ran a multi-page story with pictures that made a big to-do about my dad. He was this boy genius. He had built an organ. He had come up with solutions to problems, invented some things, and won some big award. And she was investing in his future. I have to assume that she asked the Herald to cover it, but in looking at her life, everything had a purpose, What was her aim in this? Did she want people to think she had money? Was this part of a larger con to get people to invest in some kind of Ponzi scheme? I really don't know, but I always have wondered. And then we get around to the incident. The story can be summarized like this. It was the summer of 1957, and she attempted to commit arson. She was caught, tried, convicted, and served time in prison for her crime. She would never talk about what happened. It was a huge secret, almost certainly embarrassing. The only thing she would ever say to my dad, or later my mom, was that she was forced to do it by Jose, who was threatening harm to my dad unless she went along with it. The court case is in the public record, so there's a lot of information out there about it, and it tells the story a little differently. The charge was that she plotted to burn down a 4-unit apartment complex in order to collect the insurance money on the contents of the units, which was about $14,000 or maybe $130,000 or so in today's dollars. How she wanted to actually commit the crime was the truly absurd part. She asked my dad to tell her about the boy who was the biggest deviant, the troublemaker, the person at the high school he attended who was the problem child, and asked to arrange a meeting between her and the boy. My dad did what he was asked after a little bit of reflection on his own. He didn't know exactly what his mom wanted, and she had naturally lied and told my dad something else. So one day, Teresa met the boy in the park and told him she wanted him to burn down the 4-bedroom building. She would leave paint supplies, gasoline, and turpentine in the vacant apartment. All he had to do was spill it and light a match. She gave him an upfront $100 and the keys, and said she'd give him another $400 from the insurance money once it was done. And here's where things get really difficult for me. My grandmother met with a teenage boy in a park and solicited him to commit a crime. I have to repeat that to myself out loud because it seems completely unbelievable. My grandmother met with a boy in a park and asked him to commit a crime and gave him money for it. According to the boy's testimony, he asked questions about the residents of the apartment. There was to be 3 people living there. She'd make sure 2 of them were out at the time of the fire and told them that, in quotes, the old man who lived there would be left to take care of himself. The boy testified that after he got home that evening, he had second thoughts, particularly because of the safety of the old man. A day or so later, he told his parents and they called the police. During the trial, my dad had to testify as well. Essentially, against his own mother, his testimony would have been about the introduction and what she told him specifically. I can only imagine how awkward that must have been. My dad really didn't talk about that. He just sort of put it out of his mind and wouldn't talk about it. It was something that was just so surreal. So my grandmother, as I said, didn't have much money. And as far as I know, she didn't own the property. The records indicate that she held leases on the 4 apartments, and there were tenants in 3 of them. What strikes me is that she may have been running some sort of a confidence game, or maybe fronting for someone with a more shady background who she was helping out in some way. How could she hold leases on the units and then sublet them, or make money on them, or whatever she was doing? There must have been more going on here than meets the eye. If I take a step back and look at the article about 6 months earlier about her investment in the electronics business, it occurs to me that maybe, and I stress this as I'm merely speculating, she had other people investing in whatever she was doing, and she used that money to buy the leases or maybe the whole building. I can't find any record of ownership, but I may have been with a fake name through a friend, or maybe there was a mob connection. It's impossible to know at this point. The record keeping maybe wasn't so great, and the building in question is long gone. In investigating, the district attorney and the police didn't dig any further. They arrested her for the attempted arson and the insurance fraud, and never questioned any motives or looked at ownership or anything like that. After all, this was the 1950s. A woman at that time couldn't possibly be considered as savvy enough to pull something that detailed off now, could she? Could she? They also didn't look too deeply into another very odd aspect. In my research, I concluded that this was the very apartment that she and Nick and lived in. The court documents do make reference to the old man and mention that he was an unidentified 75-year-old man living in one of the apartments. Wait a minute. Is it possible that the 75-year-old man was my grandfather? She had distanced herself from him and had spun the tale of being something like a war widow. The story changed a lot over time, but it always had some element of that in there. And in the official court record, her age is recorded as 34 years old, but she was actually about 45 at the time. Working out the dates, it would mean that she had my dad when she was 18 or 19, and no one thought twice about it because she had a story that made people take pity on her. That was part of the con game. So is it possible that my grandfather was the old man in that building who the police never really talked to? And as far as I can tell, who no one really verified the age or any other information that Teresa gave them? My grandfather would have been about in his mid-50s. At that point, he looked older than he was and walked slowly. He had gray hair, and when he had a drink, he was quite disoriented. He could have appeared to a casual observer as an old man. Whether he could pass as a 75-year-old man, I don't know, but the facts line up neatly. In my own experience, I know that when he lived with us and he was like in his early 60s or so, he looked like he was much older at that point. I would have guessed, young me would have guessed he was in his 80s. But he died when he was 69, so it's possible that this was all a setup and he was made to look older, in a sense, because of who he was. Now, backing up for a second. Of course, this is totally wild and idle speculation on my part. It might not be the case, and I have hope that it's not true. But it nags at me because no one ever looked deeper. I understand she grew to hate him, and he wouldn't agree to divorce her. So she wanted to move on and marry her new beau, Jose. But I'll go ahead and ask the question that I'm thinking out loud. She couldn't possibly have been attempting to murder my grandfather, could she? Out of spite, hatred, or maybe he had a life insurance policy. I really don't know. It just totally throws me for a loop. I always knew my grandmother was really odd. I learned about her jail time when I was in high school. But was potentially murder possible from the woman I called Nana? Is that something that could have happened? I really don't know, but it bothers me a lot. In any case, investigators didn't take long to charge her with the crime. It was a haphazard plan, and I would imagine that if the boy had managed to burn down the building, there was still a good chance she would have been connected to it and convicted of a crime. The trial itself didn't last long. She was found guilty of conspiracy to commit arson with an intent to commit insurance fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It actually turned out that she spent about 1 year behind bars, as she was contrite, had reformed, as they say, and had model behavior. It was probably an act, but she was good at being a chameleon, so she got out after a year. For the roughly year that she was locked up, you would think that my dad would have stayed with his own father, but he did not. I actually don't know where my grandfather was or how he figured into the picture. Perhaps he was unaware of what was going on, or maybe he went to Newfoundland or New York to visit family and was gone for some part of the time. Or maybe he was just incapable of caring for his son. I just don't know. She was using some variation on that war widow story, so it was easy for her to just say, oh, he's not around. Now, my dad, since my grandfather wasn't around, went to live with my grandmother's aunt on Miami Beach. He loved it. It was the first time in his life where he felt like he belonged, like he was part of a family. They actually were close-knit and liked each other. When she was released, my grandmother had a huge fight with her aunt about something related to her time in jail, and she never spoke with her aunt again, and my dad lost touch with the whole family for something like 50 years, which to me is kind of insane. Talk about your bizarre moments. Why didn't he ever try and find them and talk to them? Now, as you might expect, he wanted nothing more to do with his mother, and a while after her release, he went off to college. When my dad met my mother a few years later, she convinced him to forgive her and let her back into his life, which was probably both a good thing and a bad thing. Now, with this story, there are a couple of small loose ends that need to tie up. The first is what happened with Jose. She finally got a divorce from Nick in 1960, a short time after her release from prison. And then she married Jose in 1963 and was now Teresa Garcia. But didn't she say he threatened her son? Why would she marry him? Was she coerced? Was he somehow in on it? Like I said, the police didn't investigate deeply, and I think there's a weird loose end there. I could never find any detailed information about Jose. The name was too common, and I only have a marriage record to go on and a business card that he had from when he ran the electronics shop, but there's nothing on it that gives you any information, which just leaves it very vague, and I don't know anything about him. And the second loose end is that with no money, how did she pay her legal fees for a trial of that magnitude? It turns out that she knew a competent lawyer through the work she had been doing. Don't know how she met him, but it was somebody that she liked and was able to use. And he agreed to defend her, and she could work it off by being a receptionist or a secretary in his legal office for some amount of time afterwards. She worked for him for a couple of years, as I understand it. I do wonder if she learned any new skills from the lawyer, or if she made any new friends or found any new marks through the work. And then the last one is about the boy she hired. I did a little research into him. He was 16 at the time and had already had a criminal record through heading into this court trial. Apparently, his life of crime continued, and there were various records of his incarcerations. Sadly, he died in his 60s and could be considered a career criminal. I was hoping that maybe this set him straight, but it doesn't seem like it did, and that's kind of a sad note there. Part 7. Terry's Legacy. Teresa Garcia in 1963 had been married twice. To Nick for 25 years, and now she was married to Jose. She had had 6 names over that span, from Tessie Silverstein, Tessie Field, or maybe it was Fields, we really don't know, Tessie Kennedy, Terry Kennedy, Teresa Kennedy, and now Teresa Garcia. Her age kept changing to suit her needs, and she kept finding new ways to play confidence games for her own gain. She was always coy, somewhat secretive, and seemingly up to something. My parents got married while Teresa, who apparently added a K as a middle initial, maybe for Kennedy, or maybe not sure, while she was married to Jose. So they saw a lot of him. He referred to her as crazy, and he didn't know how he could stay married to her. Now, oddly, my mom never thought he was a bad guy. My mom had suggested that maybe my grandmother had seen him as some kind of a mark. Personally, I leaned to them being in cahoots in some way, though I really don't know in what way. In 1968, she and Jose divorced, and she went on to find a new husband, and the one she found shortly after her divorce was a man named Paul Chagru. Paul owned a series of successful clothing stores in Ohio and had a little money. He was recently widowed, and she befriended him. They were married in 1969, and he was always around when I was growing up. I thought of him as sort of my grandfather. I think he saw my grandmother for what she really was, but he didn't care because she made him happy. And now she was Terry Chagru. I never met anyone in his family, but my parents tell me that the family didn't really trust or like her. They knew she was up to no good and maybe was a gold digger. The story I heard about their courtship was that she told him she had to get away from Jose as he was violent. So they eloped in Las Vegas and then moved to Ohio for a short period of time. I have her Ohio driver's license from that period. Her age is again wrong, and she actually had another license from Florida at the same time, which is technically illegal. But that underscores that you never really knew who she was. Now, we saw Paul and her fairly regularly. But to be honest, it always felt kind of strange and a little bit forced, like she was putting on a show for us. We'd invite her to dinner, but she'd eat before she'd come and then sit in the living room waiting for us to come and join her in there. It was so strange to teenage me. Was she just quirky or was there something else going on? She and Paul opened up a couple of dress shops in South Florida. Lord and Terry's in Pompano and then later just Terry's in Delray Beach. It seemed to be a legitimate business as far as I could tell. I mean, well, then again, maybe she was feeling a little more comfortable in her 60s and was okay with running a business. But then again, maybe not. Look, I was a teenager around that time, and I went into the store to work every now and again. And in all the time I visited them, or helped them in any way, I don't recall seeing very many customers in the store. At one point, I had to look at the sales totals, and they seemed low considering the rent, and I have a recollection of asking Paul about it, and he was very polite in his giving me a reason for why it would be this way. It had to do with inventory and costs and overhead and other things. I never mentioned it again, but it sat in the back of my mind and always has. There was something about that business that just didn't feel quite right. The shops remained open until shortly before Paul's death. So was it legal? I'll say probably. Everything was so secretive with her, you never really had any idea. Heck, if I didn't actually see her in the dress shop at times, I might have thought she didn't own one. Now, Paul seemed like a decent guy, but there was more to him as well. I'm not really sure what it was, but it's at least possible that the dress shop was a front for something else or was being used for some other purpose beyond just selling dresses. I have no way of knowing what was really going on there, but in a way, to me, it would seem that the whole dress shop idea was another con of some sort. There was more happening there and it really didn't make sense. Now, I do recall that my grandmother used to host fashion shows around the area every so often. It was billed as a way to promote the latest fashion trends. She'd hire models and have them walk on a runway. But who went to these shows? As I think about it, I realize it was retirees and well-heeled people coming down for the warm winters. I remember she'd work the room and talk to people she saw. In retrospect, It might be that she was continuing to pull some kinds of cons with these people coming in to see her dresses. Look, I don't know what, but there was something odd about it. Paul died in 1984, and we thought Terry was done with marriages. She lived alone in the retirement community she was in and surprised us by starting to date again. As a college-age person, I saw that she was searching for her next mark in a way. Once in the game, always in the game. And then she found one. There was a well-to-do man who was recently widowed named Plato Carlin. They eloped in 1987, and she signed a prenuptial agreement that was to leave her with very little upon his death, basically just living expenses. I think she learned a lot about what she wanted at this point in her life, and it made sense. He took care of everything, and she didn't have to worry. Now she had taken on the name Terry Carlin. She became the social director of a retirement community and orchestrated variety shows at their place and for other retirement-type communities in the area. She convinced everyone that she had been in show business. She'd show pictures of all these celebrities she had met on Miami Beach. She'd read up on little things about these celebrities, about show business, and so on, and she'd be able to tell fictitious stories about the time she worked with so-and-so, whoever. It didn't matter. She had a story to tell all the time. She invited Plato, who went by Pete, to participate in everything she did, and he loved it. He said it kept him young, and considering that he lived to actually be 100, there's something to that. My parents and my brother and I all met Pete's son and some of his grandchildren, a lot of whom were around my age, along the way. Look, I didn't care much for them, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. Should the family happen to hear this, it's not intended directly at them. It was just my impression, and they probably felt the same way about me. There was something odd about our grandparents getting married that just seemed off in some way. And so while we did meet a few times and our grandparents were married, it's not like we were going to have regular family gatherings. We were just leading our separate lives. But my Nana had a much more specific opinion about them. One thing I came to learn about my grandmother was that she was skilled at reading people. As we got closer, she started to tell me about things that she thought about the family, things she observed, things that she noticed. And she gave me examples of why she thought that. Look, I'm not going to dwell on any of that. That was her opinion, and that's what she thought about things. And I don't like to repeat things like that. It's just what she thought. But it was interesting to watch her in action, doing her job as a con artist, as playing the game and reading people. It was really kind of interesting. Now, as far as I know, she never said anything to Pete. That was something she told me, that suggested anything about his family. That was his family and his relationship, and she just let it go. She would step out of the room and let him deal with them when they'd come, and that was the end of that. So that's the way it worked. Now, as for me, I just enjoyed talking with Pete. He was a really interesting guy who lived an interesting life, and I was really glad to have met him. Now, there's a funny small world story I can tell here. Pete was the singular meter reader for the city of Miami in the 1920s. He would ride around the city over the course of a month. One of the places he would visit was a remote water bottling plant on the western side of town. He told some stories about how he was aware there were rum runners during Prohibition working out of that water plant, but it wasn't for him to enforce the law. Well, it turns out that my wife's distant family ran that water bottling plant. We chatted one afternoon with a cousin of her father's, and he was telling us all about how they were, in fact, rum runners. He explained the methods and how they did things and whatever, and I asked him if he remembered Peter, the meter reader. And he did. And that was just one of those amusing small world stories there, that he remembered Peter coming around and reading the meters. Pete was well aware of what was going on, and they liked Pete too. He was a really good guy. Now, late in his life, Pete updated his will and revoked the prenup he had with my grandmother, unbeknownst to everyone, including her. She added so much to his life that he wanted to be sure she was cared for after he died. Of course, when he did die, the family contested the will, and when that failed, they pressured my grandmother to give them what was promised to them. Why should she have it? But in a way, you could make the case that she earned it. This was the culmination of her life's work in a way. She had enough money to be happy for the rest of her life. Now, throughout my collegiate career, I started spending more time with my Nana. She was guarded, but would tell me some parts of stories. She shared some of how she sized people up, and how she would use her skills to accomplish whatever she was aiming for. She saw people for what they really were. I learned a lot about her through her stories, and I actually came to appreciate her through her faults. She was a child of a very tough upbringing who lived through the Depression with basically nothing. She was resilient. She was a survivor. She taught me skills about keeping secrets, hustling, and showmanship for that matter. She told me about working on Miami Beach, but it was all an act. Everything was an act with her. It was really strange how that worked out. It turns out she had developed really good recall about people because she noticed things about them and filed them away in her head so that she could recall them later. When people would return to the hotel in a subsequent year, she was good at remembering them. But sometimes she had to find a way to get it started. She had to remember their name or something about them to engage with them. She'd look at their luggage tags or ask if they enjoyed getting away from the cold of Chicago just to get them to open up and remind her where they came from or their name or something. And she'd say, "Oh, wait, you're not the Johnsons," in a totally natural way, and would let them tell her their names. Or she'd ask if they spelled their names with 2 R's just to get them to open up a bit. It was a really creative way she did things, and it was very natural, and it worked for her. And I can see how she was able to pull things off that way. Kind of an interesting approach to things that worked. Another word I've heard to describe her over time was manipulative. She wanted things to go her way and would do whatever she could to make that happen. Now here's an example. My mother's parents hosted an engagement party for her and my dad, and Terry showed up to the event with a woman who was about my dad's age. It was unclear from anyone I talked to who was there whether this was who she wanted my dad to marry or if she just wanted to drive a wedge and break off the engagement. But it was bizarre in any case and made my maternal grandfather pretty angry. My mother told me she felt bad for the girl because it appeared as though she had no idea what was going on either. And Terry played games with everyone. She lived in Vero Beach late in life, about 90 minutes from the theme parks of Orlando. She told people she was going to work for Universal Studios as a show director. To support that story, she'd move her car to where no one would see it, then would lock herself in her apartment and keep the lights off and the volume low on the TV for a few days at a time. She wouldn't answer her phone or her door. She wanted everyone to believe she was busy with this exciting life where she was somewhere else. It was a very strange thing to do, but it kept up the con. At one point, she was working on a way to make money on the lottery. She was keeping track of all the winning numbers. She was trying to figure out if there was a way she could buy tickets for people, anything to continue the hustle. It felt a little odd at the time, but I kind of get it now. She was still pulling cons. She lived out her life as Terry Carlin in the place she and Pete had lived for a long time, and then later another facility in South Florida for her last couple of years. She died in 2006 at the age of 92, we think, taking with her the rest of her secrets. Going through her place after she died was also kind of interesting. She lived a fairly meager existence and didn't have much, but she did have an unregistered handgun in the back of a cabinet. She'd had it for more than 40 years, according to a document that was with it, but why did she have it? We have no idea why. It was just one of those things. Now, a few years prior, I had given her an old computer in order to get her online and be able to look things up herself. She was diligent about not leaving a trail ever. She always cleaned her browser history, something my brother had taught her when she asked along the way, kind of casually. And when she'd write something, she'd type, print, and delete. When she died, I realized that she was still a mystery in this sense. She didn't leave us any hints or clues about who she actually was. The fact that she went to such great lengths and had a gun suggests that maybe she was afraid of something and was hiding, or at least a little. Or maybe that was part of a con too. Maybe that was some other game she was playing. We know that Pete had left her some money, but she never said anything about it. Honestly, she probably had no idea what the amount was because most of it was invested and that was over her head in a way. Hers was primarily a cash and carry type of world, but certainly the amount of money he left her was enough to make her comfortable for the rest of her life. She gifted a little bit to my brother and I for college expenses, which we were thankful for, and in her will, she left almost everything remaining to an educational fund of some kind. In my mind, that was a noble thing to do, which was useful for those who could partake. And to me, it's interesting how much she valued education. She wanted to make sure that my dad, my brother, and I got an education, went through college, and had something to show for it, and hoped for the same for her great-grandchildren that came later. Perhaps it was because she had to drop out of school and led a life that she wasn't so proud of. I can't say, but it was interesting to see how she did that and how she left a legacy like that. Looking back, my great-grandmother, Terry's mother Lala, lived with us for a few months. I distinctly remember my grandmother coming over and yelling at her mother a couple of times. I wasn't clear on why, but my mom tells me it's because she was spilling too many secrets about life earlier on for Terry. And then there was this matter of another forged document. My dad was born on a Friday the 13th. My grandmother was deeply superstitious and couldn't let that stand. She managed to forge a birth certificate that made his official birthday the next day, Saturday the 14th. And that's something that only got noticed when my dad applied for Social Security the following year after she died. And the dates didn't match. Oops. It took some paperwork to overcome that and make everything right. It was like she left a little legacy for him, I think. It was a gift of sorts. So there you are. That's the story of my grandmother, her con games, her conviction, and how she was finally comfortable at the end of her life. Now, to be honest, she probably was not great at being a con artist. And in some ways, as you've heard, she was kind of, well, dumb about things. I can remember thinking that her schemes almost felt like they were from the TV show I Love Lucy. For what it's worth, my redheaded grandmother reminded me of her. But she was effective, and since it was based on her needs at the time, it all worked out for her. Now, as an epilogue to the entirety of the story, I wanted to tell one other additional tale that isn't quite related to my grandmother, but I think was kind of interesting in context. A few years after my grandmother died, I got a random letter in the mail and then a phone call from some company. It was some company that does estate planning type things, and I just kind of tossed it away. I didn't think much of it. But then I read the letter a little more carefully, and I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting. So it turns out that my grandfather, Nick, had the sister Mercedes that lived in New York. And I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. She lived in the Bronx. She had gotten married. She had lived there. And at some point, she had lived with my grandfather. That was part of the story about how she came from Newfoundland to New York. And she had met somebody and she'd gotten married. Now, whether my grandfather spent any time in New York with her and him, I have no idea. We heard tales about him going back and forth, but I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if he actually went back to New York or Newfoundland or anywhere else for that matter, but I think he did do a little bit of traveling back and forth. Anyway, so the story goes that I get this letter, and it's about this estate that Mercedes and her husband owned, and now I'm the heir to the estate, potentially. And I'm looking at this and I go, this seems kind of bogus. And the guy calls me and he tries to sell me on this idea that, I can take home, if I just claim that I'm the ancestor, he'll do the genealogical research, they'll take some cut of the money and I'll just make some money out of the deal. And the whole thing just seemed very bogus to me. It seemed I was very skeptical of it. But I did my own genealogical research and found out that, sure enough, this would have been the case. This would have been the relative that my great aunt, basically. And she did own this property, and she was the last one to die. And as far as I could tell, there were no other heirs on the husband's side of the family. However, on my side, my grandfather Nick had several other brothers who had had children. And while those children had died, the grandchildren were still around and living in Canada. So I had met some of them over the years. It seems kind of interesting to me. I guess they could have filed claim to it too, I suppose. But I was like, you know what? I don't want to get involved in this situation. It just seems kind of bogus to me. Something doesn't feel right. I'm going to let it go through its probate session, see what happens. And at the end of the day, if it turns out that there's money left over or the state sold it or something, I can then do the genealogical research and perhaps get it that way. I talked to my brother about it. He agreed that was probably the best way to go. We did consult with an attorney just to see what the story was there, but it was kind of a weird thing, right? It just sort of worked out that way. So we let it go, and it turns out that the husband did have some heirs that were left. I don't know exactly what the relationship were. It probably was about the same lineage, sort of that nephew-grandson relationship there, great nephew, whatever you'd call that, where you would have that relationship. And they did inherit the property, and they were able to take control of it. And it was worth a sizable sum of money. And they did get some amount of that. Of course, the estate company got the majority of it. But anyway, I just found that interesting. So I have some new relatives, relatively speaking, I have some new relatives that I had never met. And it's interesting to find that out. I wasn't related to them by blood, but it was interesting to see who they were and what they were doing and whatever. Not that I cared. It's not about the money. It wasn't worth the effort for me to get into it, just because the whole thing seemed so bogus and so fictitious along the way. But it was interesting to learn about that. And the bigger picture for me was about the fact that my dad had an aunt who was living in New York and was about an hour, maybe 45 minutes of a train ride away from where he was when he went up there to see the World's Fair in 1964. My mom actually was working at the World's Fair for one summer in 1964, and my dad went up there and spent a week up there visiting her while she was there, part of their courtship. And he never went and visited his aunt, just never went and saw her. I don't even know if he knew she existed, but she was just a train ride away from where he was, and I'm sure she would have loved to have seen him along the way. There's something really strange about her, about this whole situation here, that my dad lost track of everybody and had no relationship with anybody in the family after all this happened. Just really strange, right? There's something weird about the relationships that happened there. And then on my grandmother's side, on Terry's side, there was the relatives that were there. I told you he went and lived with his Aunt Golda and some of his cousins and got to know them, and it felt like family for him for the better part of a year that he lived there. But he never contacted them again after he moved away and back in with his mother, and then went off to college and never contacted them again. So it wasn't until my dad's last 1 or 2 years of life that he got in touch with them again, and we hosted some of them at our house and, had a little party and said hello and met them, and it was interesting to hear some stories and share some tales of different things that went on. But for that 40, almost 50 years in between, he never had contact with them. And it's just so strange to me that he lost touch with family. And I guess that happens sometimes. And he was so bitter about everything that happened in his life that he didn't talk about these things. He didn't relate to people. He didn't get engaged. And that part just kind of throws me for a loop. It's so strange how we have these relationships. We have these family members. And over time, he just had nothing to do with them. They were still living in Miami at that point. And then they moved to, I think they moved some of them moved a little bit north to like West Palm Beach, and some of them moved to like Sarasota. So they were still in South Florida, and my dad was in South Florida for most of his life. Very strange that he never had any communication with any of them. Just one of those oddities, I guess. And that's, I guess that's the legacy, as you think about the epilogue, that's the legacy my grandmother left, that she had this weird relationship with everybody. And, it just kind of carried forward. I guess my dad assumed that the relationship was bad on both sides and didn't want to get engaged. Kind of like I didn't want to get engaged with the real estate company, right? Anyway, I just found that really interesting. Just wanted to share those last two pieces with you because they really do tell the story in a different way. They kind of give you a little encapsulation of some more things. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this story about my grandmother and what she was, who she was, what she did. The con artist. Not a great con artist, but one nevertheless, who lived a very rough life and a very interesting life. And her story is worth telling, and I wanted to keep it alive. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it.
What's your point, David?